The sun, a brilliant orange orb, began its slow ascent over the flat lands of Mesopotamia. It was a region cradled between two mighty rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Their waters, life-giving and sacred, snaked through the plains, nourishing the soil and the burgeoning cities that dotted the landscape. This was the land of Sumer, a place where human civilization first truly took root. Here, people learned to harness the rivers, to grow crops in abundance, and to build magnificent ziggurats that pierced the sky, reaching toward their powerful gods. The air was already warm, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant bleating of sheep. Among the many settlements, two city-states, Lagash and Umma, lay relatively close to one another. Their mud brick walls rose impressively from the surrounding plains, enclosing bustling streets, busy marketplaces, and sacred temple precincts. Beyond these walls stretched vast, checkered fields of barley and wheat, irrigated by a complex network of canals, meticulously dug and maintained by generations of farmers. These fields were the lifeblood of each city. They provided sustenance for the people and wealth for their rulers. The rivers themselves were highways, carrying reed boats laden with goods connecting communities, but also sometimes serving as pathways for less friendly encounters. The people of Lagash and Umma shared much in common. They spoke similar Sumerian dialects, worshipped many of the same gods, and followed similar customs in their daily lives. They built their homes from the readily available river clay and reeds, and their artisans crafted beautiful pottery and intricate cylinder seals. However, like siblings sharing a room, their proximity also bred a natural rivalry. Each city was fiercely independent, proud of its own achievements, its own patron deity, and its own lineage of kings. This pride, while a source of strength, also contained the seeds of future conflict, especially when resources were scarce or ambitions ran high. For many years an uneasy peace had held sway, punctuated by minor squabbles and trade disputes, but nothing that threatened the fundamental existence of either city. Farmers from Lagash worked their plots, and farmers from Umma tilled their own soil, both under the watchful eyes of their respective city gods. The rivers flowed, the crops grew, and life for the most part continued its ancient rhythm. But beneath the surface of this apparent calm, tensions were slowly building, like the imperceptible rise of floodwaters, ready to spill over and engulf the land in a dispute that would be remembered for millennia to come. The Fertile Crescent was a prized possession, and its bounty was not always enough to satisfy everyone. The heart of the growing animosity between Lagash and Umma lay in a particularly fertile strip of agricultural land known as the Guedena, meaning the edge of the plain. This land was exceptionally productive, capable of yielding bountiful harvests, and both city-states laid claim to it. For generations, the exact boundary line had been a point of contention. Farmers from both sides would often find themselves working perilously close to one another, their plows sometimes crossing invisible, disputed lines. Accusations of encroachment were common, with angry words exchanged under the hot Mesopotamian sun, seeds of resentment being sown along with the grain. To try and settle this long-standing issue, a previous king of Kish, Mesilim, had been called upon to arbitrate. He had decreed a boundary, and to mark it a stone stele was erected. This stele, inscribed with cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped writing of the Sumerians, detailed the agreement and the curses that would befall anyone who dared to move or deface it. For a time, this stone monument stood as a silent guardian of the peace, a testament to a negotiated settlement. It was a physical manifestation of a treaty, a solemn promise etched in stone, meant to ensure that the fields remained productive for all under the agreed terms. However, treaties, even those carved in stone, are only as strong as the will of those who agree to them. The king of Umma at this time was a man named Ush. He, like many rulers, was ambitious, and perhaps felt that his city had been unfairly treated in the past agreement. He looked upon the Guedena with covetous eyes, believing it rightfully belonged to Umma. Driven by this conviction, or perhaps by pressure from his own people who desired more land, King Ush made a fateful decision. He ordered his men to march to the border, and there, in an act of blatant defiance, they toppled and broke Mesilim's stele. This act was more than just the destruction of a stone marker. It was a declaration. It signaled Umma's rejection of the established treaty and its readiness to claim the Guedena by force if necessary. News of the broken stele traveled swiftly to Lagash, carried by alarmed messengers and fearful farmers. The carefully constructed peace, fragile as it was, shattered. The tension that had simmered for so long now boiled over. King Ush's actions were a direct challenge, an insult not only to Lagash but also to the gods who were often invoked as witnesses to such treaties. A response was inevitable. The honor of Lagash and its king was at stake. In Lagash, the news of Ush's transgression was met with outrage and a grim sense of foreboding. The ruler of Lagash at this critical juncture was King Anatum, a man known for his military prowess and his deep devotion to Ningirsu, the powerful patron god of his city. Ningirsu was a warrior god, a divine champion who protected Lagash and guided its kings in times of war. Anatum understood that any military campaign needed more than just soldiers and weapons. It required the blessing and active support of the divine. Without Ningirsu's favor, victory would be uncertain, perhaps even impossible against a determined foe. Therefore, before any arrows were nocked or spears sharpened for battle, Anatum proceeded to the Nini, the great temple dedicated to Ningirsu. Within its sacred walls, amidst the scent of burning incense and the low chants of priests, the king prepared to make his solemn vow. He would have presented offerings, perhaps fine food, precious oils or livestock, to appease the god and gain his attention. The temple itself would have been an imposing structure, its brickwork decorated with symbols of Ningirsu's power, a place where the boundary between the mortal and divine realms seemed to blur. Standing before the cult statue of Ningirsu, Anatum would have recounted the injustices suffered by Lagash, detailing Ush's treachery in breaking the sacred boundary Stele and unlawfully seizing the Guedena. He would have passionately appealed to Ningirsu, not just as a king seeking aid, but as a loyal servant of the god, asking for strength, guidance, and the divine right to reclaim what was stolen and punish the oath-breakers of Umma. This was a crucial moment, a formal declaration to the divine realm that Lagash was embarking on a righteous war, sanctioned by the gods themselves. Anatum's oath was a binding commitment. He pledged that if Ningirsu granted him victory, he would honor the god greatly. He would ensure that Ningirsu's name was exalted and that the spoils of war would in part be dedicated to the temple. This was not merely a political maneuver. In the Sumerian worldview, the gods were active participants in human affairs. Their support was tangible, and their anger was to be feared. With his vows made and presumably favorable omens received from the temple priests through divination, Anatum emerged from the Ininu, his resolve hardened, ready to lead his city into the looming conflict. With the blessings of Ningirsu seemingly secured, King Anatum of Lagash issued the call to arms. Messengers fanned out through the city and its surrounding territories, summoning the able-bodied men to prepare for war. The mood in Lagash would have been a mixture of grim determination, anxiety, and patriotic fervor. Smiths worked overtime, their forges glowing day and night, hammering out bronze spearheads, arrow tips, and the distinctive sickle swords. Leatherworkers fashioned shields and helmets, while wheelwrights checked the sturdy construction of the war chariots, ensuring they were ready for the brutal demands of the battlefield. The army of Lagash began to assemble, a formidable force for its time. The core of the army was its heavy infantry, men organized into tight phalanxes. They were equipped with long spears, heavy shields that interlocked to form a protective wall, and bronze helmets that offered some protection against enemy blows. These soldiers trained rigorously, learning to march in unison and to maintain their formation even under duress. Their discipline was key to their effectiveness. Alongside the heavy infantry were skirmishers, lighter troops armed with javelins or slings, tasked with harassing the enemy and protecting the flanks of the main force. Across the disputed border, King Ush of Umma was making similar preparations. His city too mobilized its forces, equally determined to defend its claim to the Guedena. The soldiers of Umma were likely equipped in a similar fashion to their Lagashite counterparts, as military technology and tactics were shared or quickly copied among the Sumerian city-states. The air on both sides of the border grew thick with anticipation and the clang of metal on metal. Farmers abandoned their fields, their plowshares temporarily beaten into swords, their thoughts turning from harvest to the grim realities of impending combat. Finally, the appointed day arrived. Under the watchful gaze of their king, Anatum, the army of Lagash marched out from its city gates. They moved in disciplined columns across the plains, their standards held high, the emblem of Ningirsu prominently displayed. Their destination was the Guidana, the very land that had sparked the conflict. The soldiers knew that soon they would face the men of Umma, men who were their neighbors, yet now their mortal enemies. The fate of the fertile fields, and indeed the prestige of their respective cities, would be decided not by words or treaties, but by the bloody clash of arms. As the two armies drew closer on the flat expanse of the Guiedina, the tension was, well, just palpable. The initial phase of the battle likely involved skirmishing, with archers and slingers exchanging missiles, trying to disrupt enemy formations and inflict early casualties. But the true shock troops of the Sumerian battlefield were the war chariots. These were heavy, four-wheeled vehicles, typically drawn by teams of 4 onagers wild asses native to the region. Each chariot carried a driver and 1 or 2 warriors armed with javelins or short spears. They were not the light, maneuverable chariots of later eras, but rather mobile fighting platforms. At a signal from King Enatum, the Lagashite chariots thundered forward. Their heavy wheels churned up the dust of the plain, the shouts of the warriors and the braying of the onagers creating a terrifying cacophony. The primary role of these early chariots was to break the enemy's infantry formations. They would charge towards the lines of Umayyad soldiers, the warriors aboard hurling javelins into the packed ranks, aiming to cause disruption, fear and casualties. The sheer momentum and psychological impact of a chariot charge could be honestly just devastating, potentially causing less disciplined troops to break and flee before contact was even made. The infantry phalanxes followed closely behind their chariots. Once the chariots had done their work, or if the enemy line held firm, the heavy infantry would engage. This was brutal, close-quarters combat. Spears stabbed through gaps in shield walls, swords hacked at unprotected limbs, and men pushed and shoved trying to gain an advantage. The noise of battle would have been deafening. The clash of bronze weapons, the screams of the wounded, the shouts of commanders urging their men forward. Dust and sweat would have mixed with blood, creating a scene of organized chaos and immense human suffering. King Enatum himself was in the thick of the fighting, leading his troops from his own chariot, a visible symbol of leadership and courage. He is described as being wounded multiple times during the fierce engagement, an arrow to the eye, a spear thrust, yet he fought on, inspiring his men with his resilience. The battle ebbed and flowed, a desperate struggle for dominance. The chariots, having made their initial impact, would have withdrawn to regroup or to exploit any breaches in the enemy lines, their crews replacing spent javelins and assessing the state of their vehicles and animals. The fate of the Guiedina hung precariously in the balance. Despite the ferocity of Umma's resistance and the wounds sustained by their king, the disciplined army of Lagash, perhaps better led or more favored by the gods on that day, began to gain the upper hand. The tide of battle slowly but surely turned against King Ush and his forces. Formation after formation of Umayyad soldiers started to buckle under the relentless pressure from Enatum's phalanxes and the repeated assaults of his chariots. The line eventually broke, and what had been an organized defense dissolved into a desperate rout as the men of Umma turned and fled for their lives, hoping to reach the safety of their city walls. The victorious Lagashite soldiers pursued the fleeing enemy, cutting down those who were too slow or too exhausted to escape. The field of battle, the prized Guiedina, was now littered with the dead and dying. The Sumerian accounts, particularly those commissioned by the victors, often boasted of immense enemy casualties. While numbers might be exaggerated for propaganda, there is no doubt that the slaughter was significant. The prized agricultural land was soaked with blood, a grim testament to the cost of the dispute. For King Enatum and the city of Lagash, it was a hard-won victory. For Umma, it was a devastating defeat. As the dust settled and the sounds of combat died down, a new, more somber activity began. Vultures, the grim scavengers of the ancient world, began to circle overhead, drawn by the scent of death. They would soon descend upon the battlefield to feast on the fallen, a gruesome but natural part of the aftermath of any ancient battle. This image, so stark and brutal, would become a powerful symbol of Lagash's triumph and Umma's humiliation. The victors, Lagashite soldiers, would have moved through the field, tending to their own wounded and collecting abandoned enemy weapons and equipment as spoils of war. King Ush of Umma, if he survived the battle, would have faced a bitter return to his city, his army shattered, his ambitions thwarted. The immediate consequence of the defeat was the loss of the Guiedina, but the implications ran far deeper. Umma was now at the mercy of Lagash. The power balance in the region had decisively shifted. King Eannatum, despite his injuries, had proven his military might, and in his eyes and the eyes of his people, the righteousness of his cause, confirmed by the god Ningirsu. The conflict had reached a brutal climax, but its story was far from over. It was now to be immortalized in stone. In the wake of his decisive victory over Umma, King Eannatum was not content with merely reclaiming the Guidina and defeating his enemies on the battlefield. He sought to create a lasting monument that would serve as both a celebration of his triumph and a stark warning to any who might dare to challenge Lagash in the future. Thus, he commissioned the creation of a magnificent though grim commemorative monument, the Stele of the Vultures. This was to be no ordinary boundary marker, but a detailed visual and textual record of the war and its divine justification. Carved from a large slab of limestone, skilled artisans and scribes were set to work. The stele was designed to be read in registers, horizontal bands filled with intricate carvings and cuneiform inscriptions. One side, often referred to as the historical side, depicted various scenes from the conflict. It showed King Eannatum leading his tightly packed phalanx of soldiers, their spears bristling as they marched over the bodies of their defeated foes. Another section vividly portrayed the king in his war chariot, charging into the fray, embodying the ideal of the warrior king. These images were intended to glorify the military prowess of Lagash and its ruler. However, the stele derived its modern name from perhaps its most graphic and memorable scenes, the depiction of vultures with their sharp beaks and powerful talons, carrying away the severed heads and limbs of the slain Umayyad soldiers. This was not a sanitized portrayal of war. It was a brutal and explicit representation of the fate that awaited those who opposed Lagash. The artist did not shy away from the gruesome details, ensuring that the message was unmistakable. The battlefield, as shown on the stele, was a place of carnage, and the vultures were the ultimate symbols of defeat and desecration. The creation of such a stele was a significant undertaking, requiring considerable resources and highly specialized skills. The stone itself had to be carefully selected and prepared, and the carving process would have been slow and painstaking. Each cuneiform sign, each detail of a soldier's helmet or a vulture's feather was incised with precision. The purpose was clear. This monument was meant to endure, to broadcast Lagash's power and Ningirsu's favor to all who saw it, for generations to come. It was a powerful piece of political propaganda, a stone testament to a brutal victory and a warning against future transgressions. The Stele of the Vultures was not solely a record of mortal combat. It was equally, if not more importantly, a declaration of divine will. The reverse side of the stele, often called the mythological side, depicted an immense figure of the god Ningirsu, the patron deity of Lagash. In his hand, Ningirsu holds a massive net, a symbolic shushgal net, filled with the captured and defeated soldiers of Umma. They are shown small and helpless, ensnared by the god's power, their fate entirely in his hands. This imagery powerfully conveyed the belief that the victory was not Eannatum's alone, but a direct result of Ningirsu's divine intervention. The inscriptions accompanying these scenes reinforced this message. They recounted how Ningirsu himself had smitten the men of Umma, effectively delivering them into Eannatum's hands. The king of Lagash was portrayed as the chosen instrument of the god, carrying out divine justice. This religious framing was crucial. It elevated the conflict beyond a mere territorial dispute, transforming it into a sacred war where Lagash fought on behalf of the gods against oathbreakers and transgressors. The stele served as a public testament that Ningirsu had judged Umma guilty and had sanctioned their punishment. The practical consequences of this divinely ordained victory were harsh for Umma. Defeated and humbled, the rulers of Umma were forced to acknowledge Lagash's supremacy and, crucially, its ownership of the disputed Guidina. They were compelled to swear new oaths, this time under even more dire curses, never again to cross the re-established border or challenge Lagash's claim. Part of this submission involved the payment of tribute. The stele itself may have originally depicted scenes of Umayyad citizens bringing grain and other goods to Lagash, a tangible sign of their subjugation. Lagashite soldiers and officials would have overseen the collection of this tribute, ensuring that Umma fulfilled its obligations. This grain, harvested from lands that Umma had once claimed as its own, now flowed into the granaries of Lagash, further enriching the victorious city and underscoring the bitter reality of defeat for its rival. The conquest was not just about land, it was about resources, power, and the assertion of dominance, all legitimized by the proclaimed will of the gods. The Stele of the Vultures stood as a constant reminder of this new order, a chilling message to Umma of the price of defiance. Despite the decisive victory of Lagash and the imposing presence of the Stele of the Vultures, the deeply rooted animosity between the two city-states was far from extinguished. The harsh terms imposed on Umma, the loss of the fertile Guedena, and the humiliation of defeat bred a simmering resentment that festered within the hearts of its people. While they were forced to submit outwardly, the desire for revenge and the dream of reclaiming their lost lands and honor undoubtedly persisted. Oaths sworn under duress are seldom kept with genuine conviction, especially when pride and sustenance are at stake. Future generations of Umayyad rulers would look upon the border with Lagash not as a settled issue, but as a standing injustice. The memory of their defeat would be passed down, likely embellished with tales of Lagashid cruelty and divine unfairness, conveniently forgetting their own King Ush's initial treaty breaking. This cycle of conflict, retribution, and renewed resentment was a common feature of intercity relations in ancient Mesopotamia. Peace was often merely a pause between wars, a time for the defeated to regroup and the victors to consolidate their gains until the balance of power shifted once more. Indeed, historical records showed that the struggle over the Guedena did not end with Eannatum's victory. Later, kings of Umma, when they felt strong enough, would once again challenge Lagash's control over the disputed territory. The border ditch would be redug and then filled in, boundary stones moved or destroyed, and the armies would march yet again. The Stele of the Vultures, for all its intended permanence as a warning, could not ultimately prevent future conflicts. It stood as a testament to one particular brutal chapter in an ongoing saga of rivalry that spanned centuries, a powerful reminder but not an absolute deterrent. Today, thousands of years later, the story of Lagash and Umma, and specifically Eannatum's campaign, is primarily remembered because of the fragments of the Stele of the Vultures that have survived. Discovered by archaeologists in the 19th century at the site of ancient Girsu, these carved pieces of stone offer an invaluable, albeit biased, window into Sumerian warfare, religion, and political propaganda. Historians meticulously study its images and inscriptions, piecing together the narrative of this ancient conflict, understanding it not just as a local squabble, but as an early example of the enduring human struggles for land, resources, and power, all played out under the watchful eyes of their gods.